Not everyone who is alone wants company, and not all solitude is a synonym for absence. For many people, being alone is not a lack of connection, it is relief. A relief that does not come from preference, but from being freed from something much heavier, the emotional burden of relating to another person, a person who does not always deserve our company. There is a very common and very comfortable explanation for this behavior, the idea that some people are simply introverted, independent, self-sufficient, people who function better when they are alone. This explanation may apply in some cases, but often it only serves to hide something deeper, something less pleasant to admit, and certainly more honest. For many people, solitude did not begin as a conscious choice, but as a silent adaptation. Try to notice these signals in your body. The immediate relaxation when a social commitment is cancelled, the almost inexplicable relief when the house finally becomes quiet, the sense of mental clarity when there are no messages, expectations, or watching eyes. This does not feel like sadness. It feels like relief, as if something inside you could finally lower its guard. And what if that relief does not come from solitude itself? What if it comes from the end of an invisible effort, the constant effort of having to be someone for others? When you understand where that effort came from, many things begin to fall into place. What you always called a flaw, the social exhaustion that never seems to go away. And then the question changes. It is no longer why you like being alone. It becomes, what exactly are you resting from when you are alone? The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott said that healthy emotional development depends on the experience of being alone in the presence of someone. This is not isolation, but its opposite. The possibility of existing without performance, without vigilance, without fear of abandonment, while the other remains there, emotionally available, stable, and non-intrusive. It is within this space of trust that a person learns something fundamental, that they can relax without disappearing. In other words, someone was present enough that you did not need to monitor yourself all the time. When this experience fails, something breaks very early. If the other is unpredictable, critical, invasive, absent, or too fragile to sustain the relationship, being alone stops being a choice and becomes a refuge. The child does not learn that it is safe to exist in relationship. On the contrary, they learn that it is safer to withdraw. This is where solitude and trauma begin to intersect. From a biological perspective, solitude is not an abstract idea or a vague feeling. It is a bodily signal. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo, one of the leading researchers on the subject, showed that loneliness functions like hunger, an alert system. Just as hunger signals a lack of nutrients, loneliness signals a lack of safe connection. It is not a character flaw, it is physiology. For most of human history, being isolated meant a real risk of death. As a result, our brains evolved to treat social exclusion as a threat. That is why rejection hurts physically. That is why abandonment activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. Loneliness is not just felt, it is interpreted as danger. But what happens when this alarm goes off too early? When childhood does not offer stable experiences of connection? When closeness is accompanied by criticism, demands, emotional invalidation, or intermittent abandonment? John Bowlby, the creator of attachment theory, stated that a child does not only learn how to love, they also learn whether it is safe to love. If the bond is consistent, the nervous system organizes itself around trust. But if the bond is inconsistent or threatening, it organizes itself around vigilance. The child's body learns to anticipate rejection, loss, or emotional invasion before they even happen. In this context, solitude stops being just a circumstance. It becomes a survival strategy. Perhaps the explanation lies here. Many people who appear emotionally independent did not arrive there through strength or early maturity, but through resignation. Not because they did not need others, but because needing was never safe. Asking for support did not work. Showing vulnerability did not receive care. Expressing need was ignored, mocked, or treated as too much. The nervous system learns quickly. It lowers expectations, reduces emotional investment, learns to function without relying on relationships. This is not stored as a clear memory. It does not become a conscious narrative. It becomes automatic functioning. It becomes a pattern. It becomes identity. That is why being alone can feel so comforting. There is no risk of intrusion, no need for constant adaptation, no continuous reading of other people's moods, no invisible labor of reshaping yourself in order to belong. In this case, solitude is not emptiness, it is silence. And for someone who lived for a long time in emotional alert, silence can feel like safety. Perhaps you do not withdraw because you dislike people. Perhaps you withdraw because your body never learned how to rest near them. But this apparent comfort has a cost. Over time, the brain begins to associate closeness with strain, and it starts to interpret distance as control over what causes suffering. The presence of others activates subtle, almost imperceptible microtensions. The body enters a mild but constant state of defense. Even neutral interactions become tiring. And paradoxically, the more a person withdraws to protect themselves, the more the loneliness alarm intensifies. This process becomes a self-sustaining cycle. Chronic loneliness does not only cause suffering, it alters social perception. The lonely brain becomes hypervigilant to signs of rejection and at the same time less accurate in interpreting them. Neutral expressions seem hostile. Silence feels like abandonment. Delays feel like rejection, not because the world has changed, but because the nervous system has changed. Externally, this may look like coldness or indifference. Internally, it is exhaustion. Many people do not withdraw because they are insensitive. They withdraw because they learned that containing their emotions was safer. What now appears to be a personality trait may in fact be unrecognized emotional memory. And here an important cultural element comes into play. We live in a society that glorifies radical autonomy, a world that turns self-sufficiency into a moral virtue, that praises those who do not need others, who do not ask for help. In this context, defenses learned very early are not questioned. They are rewarded. Functional solitude becomes a sign of maturity. Emotional isolation is mistaken for strength. In this way, relational trauma disguises itself as identity. That's just how I am. I prefer being alone. People are too much work. But often these statements do not speak of preferences. They speak of history. They do not speak of free choice, but of early adaptation. The most honest question may not be, why do I like being alone? But when did being close to others start to cost me so much? The problem is not solitude itself. It is when it becomes the only place where the body can relax. When contact always feels costly, when closeness activates tension, when the absence of others becomes the only form of rest. At that point, solitude stops being a choice, it becomes a strategy. And when this is seen clearly, understanding shifts. Solitude stops being an identity. It stops being a flaw. It becomes a clue, a sign that at some point being alone was the most intelligent way to survive emotionally.